Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out getitinwriting.net/shows for a full list of our podcasts and YouTube series.
My guest is Robert Scovill. He is a live sound professional, currently on tour with Kenny Chesney. Prior to that, 22 years with Tom Petty? How many?
25.
25 years with Tom Petty.
Just right at 25, yeah.
Wow, okay. And let's see, other credits. I know you were with Rush for a while. You've had this kind of weird sort of, I mean, there are front of house guys who have a certain genre, and you're not one of them.
No, intent. That's a little bit of intent with that. I always felt like I could do anything I wanted to do. Luckily for me, I've worked with people that I really like. Like I was big fans of the bands that I've worked for, Kenny included. I mean, he's incredible. Performer.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, the transition to Kenny is almost logical. Musically. Well, what I'm saying is, musically speaking, the not that the genres are that close, although they kind of are, but the instrumentation is, and there's probably not a lot of challenge in that respect.
Well, it's funny because Kenny and I were talking about this one of the early days that I was there, and because kind of the misnomer is that Kenny is a country artist. I mean, he is a country artist, but he's so much more than that. And there are rock and roll elements to his show for sure. I mean, we do an AC/DC tune.
I know. I know.
But we for some reason we got on, and he was talking about the instrumentation, and it was the first time they were going to be out with 3 guitar players, and and I said, well, 3 guitars, bass, drums, organ. That's in my wheelhouse. I can do that one.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
I've been doing that one for 25 years. I can handle that one.
That's true. That's true. So now, obviously, you are a musician. We have seen your
You will never confuse
collection.
me with being a musician. So,
Well, but it's important, though, because it's important to have that sort of sense and sensibility.
This is true. I've actually said this many times in the past in teaching classes and other things. And discussions about this, especially with mixing. Mixing is a very interesting thing. And what I've always tried to get across to people is that, mixing is not a technical skill. It's a listening skill.
Oh, absolutely.
I can teach, my take on it is I can teach anybody to operate the console. I can't teach sensibility. I can't teach why we go for this sound or go this direction with it musically. And I definitely believe this in analog. I don't know if I necessarily believe this in digital now because of the complexity of it, but I said, you give me somebody who knows very little about music but has the science cold, and somebody who's a musician who really doesn't know the decibels and the hertz, put each one of them behind the console. I'm going to tell you which one I think is going to get the better result. And it's because we're mixing music here.
Yes.
You have to have musical sensibility to be a mixer.
Well, you do. Yeah, and you have to have a certain understanding of, now I know you've done studio work as well.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a certain sensibility that you develop there because of the how shall I say, the near perfect conditions, the ability to isolate things, the ability to do a lot of stuff that you can't do live.
Well, to me, it's more about listening in a repeatable environment, constantly over a period of time, where you build a frame of reference of what works and what does not work. And again, I said this for many years early on, and I still stand behind this. If you want to learn how to be a mixer now, where you can take a project from start to a finished project, then you need to get in the studio and learn how to mix.
Yes.
Because you listen differently there. You are invariably going to hit all the pitfalls of putting a piece of music together and get it to sound finished,
Yeah.
And something that's, I don't want to call it lacking in the live sound business, but it is a mindset that is kind of missing a little bit with a big majority of people that do live sound, because they have a tendency to, I think, and I'm going to base this on some experiential stuff, teaching, where they always want to fall back to, well, how do you handle a festival? How do you handle a one-off? How do you handle these things? And it's like, those things are super important. Like, you got to have the skill to be able to do that to survive. But the skill you really need is how do I take something and make it sound finished live, right? Like, how do I put enough detail in it to make it be this unbelievable thing, not just this thing, well, yeah, it was great, I could hear everything. I don't want to just be able to hear everything. I want it to be awesome, right?
Right.
And
right.
so what you end up with is a whole lot of guys and gals who can get a mix to about 70%, right? But trying to accomplish that last 30% of a mix where things are really, really, really right, you know, the amount of guys that can do that are small. I mean, it's not that many guys.
Now, is part of that, because, you know, now I come from studio world, and I've mixed live a couple of times. Kind of terrifies me.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm not, I like the
That's
idea of being
good.
able to do it over. Yeah, of course. I mean, it should, yes. But I've always found that fascinating, because the one thing that I'm not doing in the studio that you're constantly doing is taking the room into account.
You do. Well, of course you have to take the room into account.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, even today, you know, I mean, I don't want to say we've taken the room out of play, but of course you're taking the room into account. But the PA systems today are so good and are so capable of neutralizing the
In
space.
terms of buzzing stuff out with smart and everything.
Well, yeah. Well,
okay.
I mean, just the pattern control that we have with speakers now, we can
Yeah, of
get the
course.
vast majority of audio on the audience and not on the building.
Right,
You know?
with steered arrays and directionality and stuff, sure. hmm
So, you know, I mean, we made some enormous improvements in that over 20, 30 years.
But it's still not a studio, and you still don't have those pristine conditions, those conditions that you have control over.
Well, there are a lot of things out there that are trying to trip you up.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah.
I mean, you know, I mean, it can be sometimes the day can come down to what mic clip you're using on the vocal mic. You know, because, and I've had this happen. You know, we're using
421s or what?
Well, no, not in that sense. But I can tell you a funny story there. But you know, I mean, we're creating so much acoustic energy. You know, that mechanical isolation of microphones.
Of course. Yeah,
can be a problem, you know.
Sure.
And we ran into this with Tom, where we were using, you know, a microphone that had a fair amount of handling noise in it. So when it was fixed in the clip, I mean, the resonance down through the stand, I mean, it was causing all kinds of problems, you know.
Wow.
And literally just putting it on a more shock-mounted mic stand solved the whole day. You know,
But
I mean, it was
meanwhile,
just
you're
one of
trying
those
to
things.
figure out what it is for
What
like
the
20
heck
minutes,
is going
right?
on here? You know, so that's kind of what I'm getting at. I mean, there's so many things like that out there that, you know, years of experience, boy, excuse me, I'm dry. Years of experience will guide you to, you know, that could trip you up early in your career, where you just think, oh, change the microphone, you know.
Yeah. So when you transitioned from, I mean, you started in studio, I assume.
It was about the same in both places. At the time that I was getting into live sound stuff, I was also getting into studio stuff. I was kind of moonlighting at some studios in Kansas City right at the same time that I was working for a sound company. And they kind of went in parallel for a good chunk of time. And then at some point I realized I'm going to make way more money on live sound right now, you know, so I'm going to go do that. And then I would circle back around to it.
Wise
in
move,
the 90s,
obviously.
you know.
Yeah. So obviously that was a good move for you to go into live, but that never, I mean, it never bothered you, the idea of, I mean, the thing with live being, you know, basically you get one chance.
No, I swear that, I mean, that's part of what I love about it. I mean, when I was, you know, as I was coming up in my kind of my formative years, you know, I mean, I got exposed to concerts very early. I mean, I was really young when I went to some of my first concerts. And, you know, at that point, you know, live records were becoming a big deal. I mean, this was the era of Frampton Comes Alive.
Sure, yeah.
So, you know, like when we would examine records and we would listen to records, and, you know, me and my buddies, it was always about, wow, I can't wait to see them do that live.
Yeah.
You know, I can't wait to see them do that live. I don't know how much I experience that now when I listen to music now, where I think, wow, I can't wait to go experience that live, you know. I mean, it was just different music creation then, you know. I mean, it was just a different thing.
Well, also a lot of that has to do with the way we make music now.
Yeah.
You know, back then everything had to be live. Now you have the option. I mean, I'm sure that Kenny doesn't do it, but I know you have the option, and many bands travel with a Pro Tools rig and, you know, fire off a bunch of backing tracks and stuff like that.
Well, most of the time, I mean, in record production at that point, you weren't you weren't really making anything you couldn't do live,
Exactly.
I mean, Dark Side of the Moon would be the extreme example of it at that point. But even things like the Boston record, which was this pristinely produced record, which was very influential. I mean,
Yeah.
when I was young, I went to see him and I was like, wow, man, they pulled it off. I mean, that sounded incredible there, so.
Well, I had
That was
seen
always kind of our measuring stick,
Yeah,
It was like,
yeah.
can they pull it off live,
No, you reminded me of one of my favorite live records, Waiting for Columbus.
Oh, of course. My goodness, yeah.
And it took me years, for years I didn't know that they had actually spruced a little bit of that up in the studio later on. But most of that, I mean, I had seen the band live and they could pull that off.
Oh, they could totally pull that off, yeah.
Yeah. And
I mean, that was really the irony. I mean, and how much this would influence me going forward and things that I would do later, I don't know that I totally grasp at the time. But, I mean, live records before Frampton for sure, but even a period after Frampton, like live records were not really this thing, I mean, they were a lot of times they were used to, fulfill a record contract and, and I mean, it was expensive to go record live. I mean, you were going to go out and record live and you had one shot.
And you have,
I mean, with all the money invested in it. So if it wasn't good, you were going to go back and overdub on it and make it right, et cetera. I remember having this kind of revealed in the bootleg era, right? Which I kind of consider the 80s forward, where I won't mention any names here, but, I had records that were burned into my mind, just things that I'd listened to a million times and ended up finding bootleg copies like, front of house desk recordings of that night, and thinking, well, that's not the vocal I heard on the record here. Hang on here, that's not right. And of course you realize, of course they're going to overdub that and get it right.
Yeah, yeah.
But it kind of drove me, especially that kind of bootleg thing, because there were so many people that were so into that, and it was like coveted. I want the real thing. I don't want the produced thing.
Yeah, yeah.
It drove me to this mindset of, we've got to get to a way to capture live performances and keep them live. I mean, make them. I mean, it's a historical record.
It's
we don't want to kind of
authenticity.
corrupt the record. It's about being authentic here.
Yeah, yeah.
And that mindset was what was driving me through virtual soundcheck and, multi-track archives for live. And, in Tom's world, that's what really drove that world and he and I were very in sync with this. It's like, we're only going to use the ones that are really good.
Right.
And the ones that are really good don't need overdubs,
Yeah. Well,
so the idea was to capture everything.
it helps to have a good band. I mean, that
It doesn't
band,
suck.
Come on. That band was just absolutely impeccable, and that makes your life
doesn't
easier
suck,
too.
yes, yeah.
Let's talk about virtual sound check for a minute, because that's something that obviously you had a big input into, and that, I mean, let's zoom out from that and just talk about the whole idea of going digital to begin with, because that's where that whole thing started, obviously.
Oh, actually, not. I mean, I don't know if you know this,
Oh, do tell.
this story, but I did, really the first virtual sound checks in 1995
In analog.
in analog.
Really?
Yeah.
So you just multi-tracked and then played it back?
Well, it wasn't full analog. It was analog console, but it was
but
digital
it was Pro
recorders.
Tools recording or something.
It
right?
was ADAT at that time.
Ooh,
right.
High tech. All
Well,
right.
I've relayed this story before, but it was kind of the moment that it all happened. I had just come to work for Tom, and we were in rehearsals in Hollywood somewhere, like at Mates or something. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I'm the new guy. Whoops, sorry, I just grabbed the mic. I'm the new guy on the thing, and they hadn't been together for a while. They had been apart as the Heartbreakers and stuff for a while. Mm-hmm. So we get into rehearsals, and for the first 4 or 5 days, I mean, we're in rehearsals, we're playing 4 or 5 hours a day. They have yet to play a Heartbreakers song. Right?
Just jamming?
They're just jamming.
Okay.
It's like, oh, let's do this one. Oh, yeah, I know that one. And, I didn't totally get it at the time, but in hindsight, it was like, well, what they were doing was just getting back together.
Right,
I mean, they were
right.
just
Getting the
feeling
groove.
each other out
Yeah.
and getting in the groove. But what frightened me was we have one more week of rehearsals here. It's like, I may get to the first show and may only have one pass on the console, I mean, it was just like, it kind of panics me a little bit.
Did you have automation at that point?
Oh,
or this
no,
was an
no,
analog
no,
console
no,
too?
this
So you
was
really had to
full
learn your
analog.
cues and stuff. Yeah.
There was no cues at that point,
Yeah.
Uh, So at that point I had the studio going here, and we had analog machines here, but I had also invested in ADAT. It was a Friday, and I remember calling my wife and I say, I need you to grab a screwdriver, and I need you to go in the studio, and I'm going to walk you through how to take these ADAT machines out, and I need you to send them to me. I need them here tomorrow. I need to FedEx them here tomorrow. And I had, my A2 on the thing, I luckily at the time, just luckily, we had a Gamble EX56 console out, which had full patch bay, full multi-way inputs into a mic scramble into the thing. So my thinking was, okay, if I can get the machines here and we can get the interface built, I can essentially just create a second insert point on the console, right? Where I can have an insert point that comes right off the preamp, goes right to the inboard processing, any processing I have. And that way I'll be able to just choose whether I'm listening to the band or listening to the tracks.
Okay.
It was going to work out. I could kind of see it. And it was like digital. It's going to be a zero pass through. I'll listen on
Pretty daring, though.
Well, there was nothing at stake at that point. It was just
you're in rehearsals, sure,
right?
but yeah, okay.
So we get it in, we get it hooked up, and I record the first day, and you have the moment of like, okay, well, let's see how this is going to work. Rewind it back, hit play, and everything's coming back into the console. I'm like, wow, this is just like if the band was sitting. You could work on every piece of it.
Yeah.
Bands walking by the room, they're like, what's going on? Are you taping this? One of those things. No. Well, that's us playing, right? Oh, yeah, whatever. So that was really it. And, I kind of spent the next, 10 years, I guess, kind of refining and validating that whole thing. At some point we switched over to Pro Tools, but, I recorded, all the petty stuff from that era. When I went over to Rush, we actually moved it up to 72 track ADAT.
Wow.
Which you were talking about ambitious. That was ambitious.
Yeah, especially the way those machines locked.
Right. Yeah. Which, you mean the way they did not lock?
I had 24 tracks of it. That was plenty to experience. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But this was almost the validation for it. Where we were out on Rush, and we made an attempt to record all those shows, but because of the sync challenge, we didn't get them all recorded. I think we may have successfully recorded 20 out of about 40 or 50 shows.
It's pretty good, actually.
Yeah, well, it was a nightmare, really. But at the time, and nobody had a sense of this at the time, that was on the Test for Echo tour, and that was the last Rush tour, right?
Oh.
After Neil's wife passed and his daughter passed. And, there was all of a sudden this epiphany after months of this happening. It was like, those may be the last Rush recordings ever.
Wow. Yeah.
That's a very real thought here.
Mm-hmm.
So now all of a sudden there was a lot of emphasis put on that. It's like, oh, we got to have those. We got to transfer them. We got to start mixing on them. And could they have been done better? Absolutely, they could have been done better. But
they were done.
That's the point. It was what it was.
Yeah.
So
you captured it.
To me, that was when the whole concept of multi-track archiving kind of really, all the tumblers fell into place for me. It was like, yes, this needs to be done. It's so inexpensive to do it. If you're out performing live, they need to be recording it, period. Full stop.
Well, and now we do.
And put it away.
Yeah. But of course, now storage is that much cheaper and you can do it.
It's a fraction of what it was even then,
You buy a box of hard drives before you hit the road.
Yeah. Well, right? The next time I was out with Petty, we had switched over to Pro Tools, and, I was doing 64 track Pro Tools for 2.5 hours, a night.
Wow.
Which it was, it's funny to see this happened twice. It was funny to see the manufacturer's response to it, right? Like at some point, Ted Keflo with Alesis came down to rehearsals, and we were in the big room at this point, and he had no idea I was even doing this. He just thought we were recording. And he goes, "Wow, nice recording rig." I was like, "Yeah, watch this." Band's off stage. I just hit play and started mixing the show. And he was like, is this going on he just couldn't piece it together. He was like, what is happening right now,
Well, and that's, it's interesting because, everybody knows the story of how ADAT's democratized home recording.
Yeah.
But, you're right. It must have done the same thing with live sound.
Well, it was the path to that. And then, you fast forward 10 years and I'm working at DigiDesign, and we're going to make it a feature in the I mean, it was a natural fit for Pro Tools and the Venue console to be able to do those two things. I mean, you were going to, and I still think we do it better than anybody else.
Oh, I agree. I agree.
I mean, they do it in a way that's just fantastic. You know, I use it every time I go out.
Now let's talk about a little bit about your association with companies, because for the longest time, there was sort of a dichotomy between either you're a musician and or a live, you know, you're either the artist or you're working for the company. And you have always successfully bridged those two.
I honestly, I don't know how it happened. I really don't. But at some point, it just seemed like a really, really natural progression. I have to give DigiDesign in particular and Avid credit for kind of seeing it. You know, it would have been very easy to dismiss it and just kind of go, no, you work for us now. But they saw the power in having somebody credible in the field evangelizing their products.
Yes.
Right? They saw the power of that. And especially with what we were doing on the tour. I mean, I had the luxury with Tom Petty and that production to be able to hold, we call them soundcheck events, but it was really just demonstration of the console's capabilities, right? And we were demonstrating virtual soundcheck. We were doing all of it. And we would have, you know, like I would invite people in, you know, just put out a notice that we were going to do it and invite people in. And we'd have 30, 40 people show up at the show at 11 o'clock in the morning, and they would see us tune the PA. We would talk about the console, et cetera. I think over the course of my time with Avid and working with Venue, I think I tallied it up at one point. I think we had run almost 5,000 people through that program, you know, over the course of a year.
Wow.
And, you know, and I don't know if I want to go down this path, but, you know, that didn't cost Avid or DigiDesign a single penny. Not one penny.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was on the tour already. I mean, if it cost them anything, it was, you know, like some drinks for catering. You know?
Oh, boo-hoo. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But I mean, you try to put that into a marketing budget. So like, how much is that worth to you? You know?
Yeah, exactly. And how many of those people then, you know, I mean, that was the thing, because I remember, because as I mentioned to you earlier, you know, my company handled most of the marketing rollout for Venue when it came out. And we talked to a lot of front of house people, and almost all of them were very, very reticent about the idea of a digital console at all.
Yeah.
You know, and so a lot of what you were doing really sort of lent legitimacy to that, not only because here's a guy who's done front of house, but because here's a guy who's doing front of house.
See,
and that was the big difference.
That was the
right
credibility of the demo.
Exactly.
It's like, we're not demoing here. You're seeing it actually being set up to use here in about 2 hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So there's no fluff in this, you know?
Yeah. That was the beginning of a lot of merging of, you know, a lot of companies now have people who are, shall we say, consulting to them while they're still out there working. And that was something that didn't used to happen.
No.
You know, if you were working for a company, it was because you were a former engineer or a former whatever, you know. And so
I think certainly in the digital console world, it's very well served by that, because I know having the console out and actually working with it under fire, you think differently as like, no, we've got to be able to do this. You know?
Hell yeah.
I mean, it refined the workflow dramatically, way faster than it ever would have just doing it on normal research.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. Everybody that I knew at the time at, I guess it was it still DigiDesign?
Up until 2010?
Yeah, 2012? So I guess when the console was coming out, it was still DigiDesign. But you know, everybody was talking about how your input, because you were actually working with it, how that really helped to shape the product.
Yeah.
So,
and I think, you know, ironically, maybe it's not ironic, you know, we did a similar thing with EAW, right?
Yeah.
With Adaptive, because we had Adaptive out on 2 tours, and on the second tour, I thought, okay, well, if we're going to do these presentations and they're going to be part of the system tuning, why don't we just do an Adaptive presentation as well? And I just did it just because I thought it would be great for the people to see and hear, and I believed in the product. Well, now here I am working for EAW now, in the same role I had at Avid, you know.
Well, and that's interesting too, because EAW now a lot of people have done that whole digital steering thing. You know, Renkus Heinz did it for years before they did, and I think there was a company. Oh, so was it Den Audio? There was a company that actually there was a guy who basically invented the concept, and I can't recall his name off the top of my head, but
But I'll say nobody's quite done it like
well,
Anya and Anna.
well,
are
yeah,
doing it,
because
and
they
AC6.
actually combined the concepts of a traditional line array with a steerable center, and that was
It's an amazing technology that I'll go on record right now as saying I don't think it's gotten its due yet. You know, I mean, it got kind of caught up in the wash of EAW going through, business
Changes
issues,
of ownership,
changes
shall we
of
say?
ownership. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it got caught up in that, but it's still a very viable technology. It was years ahead of its time.
oh
So it's like, okay, it's just because it's, it was released in 2012 or whenever it was, doesn't mean it's, it's not worthy of the time. It's still a very, very viable product. I mean, it's just an incredible piece of technology. So hopefully, I mean, that's going to be part of my role there, is to kind of hopefully enlighten the world on what this actually is and what it can do. So
the idea of being able to do a dead hang with an array is just amazing right there.
I mean, really, not to go into all the EAW talk here necessarily, but having that kind of driver density in one of their cabinets and having it have this full steer capability of 180 degrees, essentially, you can, and I think this is going to serve the market really well when they really understand that this is possible, that you can have a wider vertical dispersion with a smaller amount of boxes than you can an articulated array. They can hang a very short array and still cover the entire vertical geometry.
Yeah.
That is simply impossible with articulated array.
Not only that, but you can split it. So, like, let's say you're
you
in a
make
place with
asymmetrical coverage,
with a balcony, you can split it
you
so it
can
doesn't bounce
actually
off
do
the
that.
facade. Yeah, and that to me is just fantastic.
The irony of it is that, with holoplot now and some of these more modern versions of this, it really, to my thinking, lends validity to the whole Anna thing.
Yeah.
It's like they're saying what you're saying is right. They're just another version of it now.
Yeah.
So that's it's going to be interesting to watch it go forward. Really is.
So, do you have an actual formal engineering background, or are you self-taught at all this stuff?
Well, after high school, I went to a technical institute and studied for a double E in electronics. I did not finish. I ended up going on the road. But yeah,
Funny how that happens.
Yeah, I look back on that and I just think, wow, where would I be without that schooling? Because it gave me the language.
Yeah.
Like when people talked about 3 dB down points. Here I am, 18 years old. I knew what they were talking about. I knew a lot more about, really, in terms of a practical sense, I knew more about what was going on underneath the lid of the console than I knew what was going on outside at that point. I knew about the design of it. So that was a big advantage for me, big advantage.
Well, and that's, I think, probably, if we can look at reasons for success, one of the things that you've managed to do is to really integrate the left brain stuff and the right brain stuff, and that having that understanding is essential when you're talking to the artists. I tell a story about, being in the studio one time and I had a guitar player ask me if I could make his guitar sound a little more Browne, and being able to understand the principles behind, okay, first of all, what's he saying? Right. But then how do I accomplish that? And how do I accomplish that? That's the left brain stuff.
Well, that's the communication skill.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
I mean,
it is.
And mixing, whether you want to say it or not, or doing sound, is a communication skill.
Oh, absolutely.
You're trying to communicate a musical idea to an audience member.
Well, and you were talking earlier about, if I have a musician versus if I have a technical person, I would say that I would extend that concept to say communication skills.
Yeah.
I mean, I had somebody posted the other day a question on one of the forums about how, what's the most valuable skill for a young person coming in now, and my response immediately is communication skills.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, I can teach you how to run a compressor. I can't teach you when it's appropriate to keep your mouth shut. And that's really important.
Well,
I think,
and it's very true in the touring world as well. It's like, man, I've said to so many people, you got to be able to hang out there.
Yeah, it's so much more important to know that you understand
it's
that.
equally important. I don't want to say it's more important. If it is, it's a slight edge. But it's like I've certainly seen my instances in my life of people that were totally together on the technical side. I mean, incredible mixers, but had the personality of a slug. I mean, you couldn't hang with them,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, it's not like the artist is going to fire somebody because, you know, they're not getting along with somebody, but you just naturally get weeded out.
Yeah.
You know, it just happens over
It's
time.
attrition. It
Yeah,
is.
it is totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by the same token, I've seen guys who couldn't mix their way out of a paper bag, but because the artist had faith in them that
know
they
a
were
couple
never
of
going to
those.
let things get out of control,
Yep.
they were in that seat.
Yeah.
You know? I've
Yeah.
seen that happen on numerous occasions.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, a lot of times it does come down to, does that mixer have that communication with the artist that is so essential?
Yeah, yeah.
Because that's going to be way more important.
You gotta. I mean, you gotta be able to talk to them on their level. And I mean, that's not meant to sound demeaning, but it's like I mean, I learned very quickly with Tom. It's like, don't go up and start talking decibels and frequencies. I mean, don't even let that come out of your mouth. You better be able to find a way to distill this down into language that he can understand.
Your guitar's too brown.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's really true, man. I mean, that, you know, that is 90% of the creative process right there, is for us to be able to communicate and then translate to decibels. And
Wait, I mean, you talk about the whole left brain, right thing. I think that's what separates the men from the boys in terms of mixers, et cetera, is somebody who can take something extremely, extremely left brain in its mechanics and use it creatively.
yeah.
That's what separates the big boys.
Well, and you know, I mean, you can go back to like all the Abbey Road stuff, you know, and I've had this conversation with people before, you know, George Martin, absolute genius, no question about it. But the Jeff Emmerichs, you know, the engineers there were the guys who figured out, okay, I can stand over here with a pencil and you loop this tape. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that really made.
I tell you, for me, the watershed moment of that, I stand by this, is Tomorrow Never Knows.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
I remember the first time I heard that, and I didn't really have this epiphany at the time, other than to say, what is happening right now? You know, this is coming from Mars. I mean, what is happening right now? You know, put 20 or 30 years on that and you look back and you go, that has to be the day that recording was no longer a service.
Yes.
A janitorial service. Recording became a part of the creative process
form.
right there.
Absolutely.
The creativity in that was breathtaking, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And that, I think, really did change the way that engineers were perceived, because you were no longer the white coat guy.
You were no longer white coat guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It's funny how many people refer to it as white coat guy.
Well, you know, you see all those pictures, you know, and I mean, listen, to me, probably one of the huge moments in my life was having the privilege of walking down those stairs in Studio 2 at Abbey Road, you know, and just thinking, because you walk down there, and I don't know if you've ever been in that room, but
Oh, yeah, I have.
it's such a clinical, ugly, funky ass room. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's just, you know, how the hell did you guys create such wonderful stuff in such a shit environment?
Yeah.
Oh my God, you know? But it really shows just how those guys managed to really, you know, just interpret all that, you know? I mean, Ken Scott, you know, dude, really? I mean, I'm more in awe of him than I am of George Martin in that sense, you know. But yes, it took a whole chain of interpretation.
Well, I mean, you know, even go back to the Tomorrow Never Knows thing. The story, as I understand it, was that George had bought each one of the band members these little portable cassette players so that they could go back and work on their stuff. And all they did was go out and record these crazy sounds and everything, and those ended up in the track.
Yeah,
it was the first example of sampling, really.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
really. So
and what was
it's
the other
just
one?
brilliant. You know?
Revolution Number 9.
Right,
all that
right.
Sound collage stuff, you know. That was, again, you know, just like Paul walking around and, you know, recording birds in trees and stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that to be able to then take that and help that artist to realize their musical vision, you know, that's got to be
into
pretty
a musical
amazing.
format. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so for you, then transitioning to live, what other challenges were there for you? I mean, obviously you had a lot of understanding of stuff coming from Studio World.
Yeah.
But the spontaneity and everything else, did that influence your mixing style?
I don't know if it influenced my mixing style. I think, honestly, I think it probably more influenced my style, my mixing style, when I came back to the studio. You know,
Oh, yeah, okay.
where
Uh-huh.
you know I became this kind of evangelist for, you know, in the studio, trying to keep it real. You know, I mean, that just sounds so corny to say it, but it's like I was way more about recording the ensemble. You know, and you know, this was, keep in mind, you know, when I got back and started my own studio and my own label, this was in the early mid '90s, and this was when Pro Tools was really starting to catch fire and
Sure.
its legs.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember getting it and being into it, but I just remember thinking, this is not how I want to do it. You know, this is not how I want to do it.
Yeah.
I don't want to record single instruments at a time. I mean, if we're talking about an overdub, okay. But this whole idea of, well, let's just record the drums and then we'll put the bass on it. I mean, it gets back to our discussion at NAMM. It's like that there is a communication that takes place there that you must respect.
Yes.
You must respect.
Yes.
And when it's right, there's nothing that can match that. Nothing that can match that musically. And I mean, I stand by that to this day.
Oh, you know, it's funny because, well, you and I have both taught. And I did a college class 3-4 years ago. And one of my first questions was, okay, I know that everybody in this room has never lived life without the internet. But how many of you have ever been in a band? Right. And out of 12 people, I had one who had been in a band, which meant that all of these other people, it's not that they didn't understand analog. It's that they didn't understand ensemble.
Yeah, they don't understand ensemble. That's
and that is huge, because that really, as you say, you know, that's, you know, if you go back to the Al Schmidt days, you know, you recorded it as if it was already, you recorded it with the mix in mind.
Right, 100%.
Everything, you know,
Yeah,
because you
100%.
want to do as little as you need to do in the mix. And now it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah,
that
we
really
flipped
changed.
it upside down. I mean, you know, I'll say up until the mid '90s, maybe a hair after that, we were living in the era of the recordist, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a person
Yeah.
who could capture the thing and make it right. And now we're in the land of the editor. We're in the era of the editor.
It's
so it's
true.
not really, I mean, really in DAWs where we sit today, you're not, I mean, you are mixing by the strictest of definitions, but you're not mixing, you're editing it into place. You know?
Well, I just phoned in a bass part for somebody a few days ago, and she said to me, well, don't worry about the first part because I'm just going to cut and paste, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, okay.
And see,
you
what
know?
I mean, I get the, you know, the economics of the world that we live in, and that we have to make records that way. I guess.
We don't have to.
But
we
it
do.
is a real just shunning of this idea of communication between musicians, and that actually happens and has impact. You know?
It's a stylistic thing too. I mean, some genres obviously are, you
Of
know,
course,
different than
without
others.
question.
And, you know, I mean, look, total respect to somebody like, oh, what did I see the other day? Billie Eilish and her brother
Yeah.
editing down to the syllable, you know. And,
Well, I lived through that with Def Leppard.
oh,
right?
sure. Yeah, of course.
I lived through it, and I don't want to say it messed me up. It didn't mess me up. It was an incredible learning experience. Working, you know, kind of side by side with Mike Shipley at times was, without question, one of the greatest experiences I've had. I learned more about audio and listening during that period of my life than I ever did, because you learned how to zoom in. You know, I mean, way
Right,
in,
right.
way in.
Yep.
And they were doing things, I mean, so far ahead of its time there. But by the same token, it made me also, I absolutely also realized from working with that band how detrimental that can be to the band unit. I mean, I'll use Steve Clark as my example here. And keep in mind, I mean, I wasn't around all the early days of that band. But, you know, what I discovered being there with them is how much Steve loved playing live and how much he hated being in the studio.
A lot of musicians are like that.
Which he just didn't have the mindset and the, you know, the ability to sit there and go over and over and over and over the same part, looking for the right thing. You know, he was way more instinctual, way more.
Yeah. First take. And,
Let's go, let's rock. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, as cliche as that sounds, he was all about the performance, and I think it drove him down. You know.
Well, and there are a lot of musicians like that. There are a lot of musicians with whom the more takes you do, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
Because they're just belaboring it and the spontaneity is gone.
Well, Petty and those guys were like that. You know,
I could
it's
believe
funny
that.
how,
Yeah.
you know, you talk about things working in circles sometimes, you know. My experience, you know, having my own label and doing my own studio thing and having that kind of realization of, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a guy who's into recording Ensemble here. You know, if you want, I'm not going to do the single instrument thing. Fast forward now about 10 years, and I've done, you know, developed virtual soundcheck. And I hid it from Petty for a long, long time. They never knew I was doing it for the longest time, until it released with Venue. And then all of a sudden, somehow we kind of got on the discussion. This was at the time that they were in the clubhouse there in Tarzana, I guess it was, you know, which was their rehearsal space. And I remember him bringing it up a couple of times, thinking, where he was saying, I just don't want to go to the studio. You know, it seems like, you know, we play way better at the clubhouse. I don't know why we can't just record there. And the light bulb went off. And I remember thinking, okay, well, we'll put a Venue monitor console in there, and we'll build a little isolation room, a little control room for Ryan, and he can put Icon in there, and they can share a common Pro Tools rig, right?
Oh,
so they'll
sure.
just set up, like, the monitor rig will be the front end of the recorder. He'll be mixing and tracking while it's going on in there. And what it allowed them to do, and again, you underestimate the power of this, I think. What it allowed them to do in that room was record without headphones on. They played.
That's a huge deal.
They played they had their stage set up in there exactly as they set it up live, and they started tracking records.
So they were never on in-ears?
No.
Oh,
No.
Interesting.
No, they're all about speaker. I mean,
Wedges
Tom went to one ear and a wedge. He would do that thing, you know, which was, you know, the way he was doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I
sign off on.
understand that. Although, you know, I did artist relations for Shure Microphones.
Yeah.
And, you know, when we were coming out with the first in-ears, that was one of the things that was the constant fight of like, no, don't do that, because that's going to destroy the whole reason for having in-ears. You
Right.
know? But everybody did it.
Yeah.
You know, and there were some people who you just could not convince, no, this is the way I'm going to do it. You know, at that point, you might as well stay on wedges, you know.
Yeah.
Now, have you mixed monitors?
I did in my early days, yeah.
Because that's a totally different world too.
Yeah, I learned quickly I didn't want to do that.
The most deadly place on earth is Monitor Beach.
True.
Yes.
It's true. Well, I mean, I got my start mixing monitors, you know, for a band out of Kansas City. So, you know, it was a great school. It was a great school.
That's funny, actually. Who was I talking to recently about this? Carrie Kais. Do you know Carrie?
Yeah.
Carrie's wonderful, and she's always been mostly a monitor mixer.
Yeah.
You know, and she made an observation that I thought was very interesting. She said, you know, if you're a front of house mixer, to a certain extent, there's some ego involved because everybody's listening to your mix. Whereas if you're mixing monitors, nobody gives a shit about your mix except one person.
Except for one person, yeah.
You know, and it can be the most lousy, horrendous mix out there, but if that's what they want, that's what you're giving them.
Then success. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I'm just thinking, you know, that's got to be a lot harder to be a monitor mixer with wedges than, I mean, you know, having in-ears, having the whole band on in-ears, that's got to be just absolute heaven for a monitor mixer.
See, I disagree with that.
Why so?
Because if you're on wedges, I may hear from monitor engineers going, "You're out of your mind, that's not right." But on wedges, you know, you're creating an overall sound on that stage.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, you're going to have pockets of places that are happening there. When everybody's on ears, you are responsible now for everything in their ears.
Yes.
Meaning you're going to have to manage 8, 10, 12 fully developed mixes now, right?
That's true, but changes you make to one are not going to influence the other 11.
That's
right?
true, but think about the amount of work in managing all of those inputs rippled through all of those mixes.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Like
so what you're saying is it sucks either way.
Well, yeah, I guess that is what I'm saying. I mean, I've seen guys that can obviously do it very, very well. I mean, you know, Baxley's one of the great ones at that. So you know, it can be done. But in terms of, you know, I have enough trouble worrying about one mix. Don't multiply it by 12 for me now.
Yeah.
Where, you know, I've got to deal with the sensibilities of 6 or 7 people and get it right for all this. That's how you end up with the Grateful Dead having 5 monitor consoles, because everybody wants a different hi-hat EQ. you
Yeah.
know, so.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's another. That's a rabbit hole we won't go down.
I mean, I'm fine with going down there because I have great respect for them. I mean, we wouldn't be where we are today without the Grateful Dead.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, and knowing what the Grateful Dead did also gave me a tremendous amount of respect for John Mayer.
Oh, of course. Yeah. How could it not?
Dear God, dude. You know.
I mean, talk about being ahead of your time.
I mean, when I was artist relations for Shure, we used to spend every summer at Montreux.
Yeah.
And, you know, John and Helen used to be out there all the time. And I've had some amazing conversations with John. It's like he's one of those people who, if you have a conversation with him, you just better buckle in. You know? Because it's going to be all over the place.
Well, I remember one of the very first conversations I had with him, which was, in hindsight, was really important. We got to talking about, we got on the subject of phase and, you know, a lot of really kind of geeky stuff. And I remember walking away from that discussion thinking, boy, you better get your shit together. I mean, you got a long way to go. You got a long way to go to really understand what is happening here. So it really drove me to dig in and really start to understand what is happening out here, you know.
So you've gotten more technical as you've advanced.
I've gotten more studied for sure. You know, I have learned, I feel like I've got a really good handle on how to apply the technology in specific ways, you know, specifically, you know, how to integrate analog to digital and how to take something digital and make it sound analog when it needs to be, you know. So that's the part of digital that I love, is that it is so fluid. I mean, you can make it be as analog as you want it to be, you know.
But the irony there, if you think about it, is that at this point, there's more stuff that's done for us. And to a certain extent, you don't have to know as much. I mean, of course, you know, it's important to and it helps to, but there's a lot of people out there who don't understand a lot of the basics of signal flow.
Well, signal flow for sure, but the one that gets me a lot of times, and you know, I'm sure my age is going to show here, but when we talk about, you know, analog gear now, there's this reverence to it that I think is, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say it's unhealthy, you know. It's unhealthy.
It's interesting.
Here's where I go with this, because I see a fair amount of people do this now, where they'll associate themselves with specific analog things as if that's the cure-all.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Okay, well, I must be good because I'm associated with that analog gear.
Right.
It's like, you still got to do the work. I don't care whether it's analog or digital. You still got to do the work.
Well,
right?
and that's just it.
Just plugging in that analog box on the signal chain is not going to make it great.
But that's what so-and-so used on this record, so it's got to be, and that's the mentality that always bugs me. You know, it's like well,
there's this like brand identity, like on personal brand, it's like, well, he must be credible, he's mixing on analog. That's like, what?
Yeah, that really comes down to that whole idea of, you know, have you learned your craft, or are you just investing in a piece of gear because someone else used it?
Yeah.
You know, and that, I think...
I mean, do I see things that other people use and go, ooh, I can't wait to try that? Of course. Of course.
Yeah.
But you, like, I don't know, there's something about it that really, really irks me.
It's an interesting thing, because I see a lot of that, you know, with people wanting to buy certain pieces of gear because so-and-so used it.
You can't buy a sound. You just cannot buy a sound.
You really can't. And you can't buy a style either. You know, it's like I'm always...
Well, guitar players are the most famous. We had this happen multiple times on Petty, where people would come to the show and just kind of go, what's Mike Campbell using up there? Well, yeah, what amp is he using? What pedals? I mean, they were just breathless about it.
Yep.
And it's like, dude, I could hand you Mike Campbell's guitar right now. You wouldn't sound any more like Mike Campbell than anyone.
That's just it. I mean,
it is here.
It's like everybody wants a John Bonham drum sound. I'm sorry, he's not.
We talked about this the other day.
Yeah. You know, it's like, I mean, I get it that you want to have that sound, but, you know, there's two things that bug me about that. Number one, the fact that you're not going to get it no matter what. And number two, how about trying something new?
Yeah. I guess that is at the crux of my gripe here, is there seems to be an awful lot of focus on what I'm doing it with.
as opposed to what I'm doing.
what I'm doing with it.
Yes,
You know?
exactly.
Like, how about we focus on the craft and not the tools, you know?
Yeah. Well, what was that? I just heard something recently. Somebody was talking about audiophiles.
Yeah.
And the joke about audiophiles
Yeah,
was...
I know this. Yeah. And it's perfect because it's true.
Right. What is it? It's audiophiles use your music to listen to their gear instead of the other way around.
Instead of using the gear to listen to the music.
Yeah.
It's
and
true. It's absolutely true.
You know, for years, my little 4-track studio, I had a Juno 106. That was my only synth, you know. And boy, did I milk the hell out of that, you know, because it was all I had.
But it's because all you had,
Yeah. And, you know,
well, I mean, we definitely suffer from that in our world right now. And this thing, I call it choice fatigue. Right?
Yes, I call it the paralysis of analysis.
Yeah.
Same thing.
I mean, it's where, you know, and, you know, the first time any of us, I think, really experienced choice fatigue was the first time there was ever a Lexicon 224 in the studio.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, no longer was it about the snare drum. It was about the snare sound we were going to get with the reverb on it. We sit there and, you know, in this $2,000 a day studios, next. No, that's not, that one's cool. I don't know. You know, I mean.
Exactly. And now we do that with, you know, synth patches.
Yeah.
You know, oh my God. I mean, you know, and especially, you know, and God bless all of these virtual synth manufacturers, you know. I'm a big fan of Cherry Audio, right? And they've got these wonderful vintage synths, but I want one sound, you know, and I don't want to spend 3 hours going through my presets. You know, I was talking about this with someone the other day. We were talking about the idea of AI. Could I get AI to be able to say, you know, like, okay, I want a Hammond sound sort of like Stevie Wonder did on this song over here, but I want it a little more, you know, and just pull up those patches.
I guarantee you that's going to happen.
It has to.
That's 100% going to happen.
Yeah, because otherwise I'm going to be going through 4,000 patches, you know, and of course the other thing about it is patch, you know, designers who design the patches for these sounds, they're more concerned with coming up with clever names than real descriptive names. You know, so it's like, oh, okay, Marvin's blah, blah, you know, what the hell does that sound like? I have no idea, you know. So
I'm kind of going through that right now. You know, I recently picked up an Eventide H9000. You know.
Ooh,
it's a lot of box. It's a lot of box.
Yeah.
But, you know, just the names that they give to stuff, it's like, it forces you to have to go listen to it and then go, no, that's not at all what I want. Okay, let's go to the next one.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of times I'll leaf through them without looking at the names because the names are going to prejudge.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like,
but
nah.
I've kind of backed off of that approach a little bit even now, where I got to say the unit is beautiful. The user interface on it is fantastic. You can be really fast on it.
Yeah.
But they've got it broken down where you can get down to the base algorithm and just create your own of anything you want to do, whether it's a plate, a reverb, whatever, you know, you can just, and do it really pretty quickly. So I've kind of belied all the ones that have been pre-made and just go, I'll just start with the base algorithm and make what I want, you know.
Yeah.
And it's worked out really good. I'm going to use it on the upcoming tour. So.
Well, you have that advantage though, and I think there are a lot of less experienced people that don't have that advantage, and they're going to start with presets, and you know that's fine.
That's fine.
Start with a
I'm not
preset
gonna
and
knock
tweak
them to
it,
that.
you
Yeah.
know. But I think the idea of being able to understand those basics is so valuable.
Well, again, and how many times do we see this now? And I promise I'm not trying to bag on the new engineers and et cetera for doing it. They don't really have any choice. But, you know, talking about, you know, oh, I'm going to use an 1176 on that or an LA2A, you know, whatever. It's like, and not even really understanding the difference in those topologies and how they react.
Yeah.
But just putting it on because it's notorious.
Because it's old.
And it's old and
Yeah,
it's vintage, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it's vintage, sometimes just really old.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in fact, actually, there used to be a running joke about that. I think it was LA2As. You know, I worked at a couple of studios in LA in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. So I was at Cherokee and then as a Paramount. And during those years, if you found an LA2A in the recycler, which was, you know, this was before Facebook Marketplace, of course. If you found one, it was because Shelly Yakus had bought it, decided that it wasn't good enough, and sold it again. Because he had all the good ones.
Right.
You know? And that, I think, you know, yeah, he understood enough. Well, he and I guess who was working for him, and Gary Meyerberg probably. But, you know, those guys, they really got what it was supposed to do and what it was supposed to sound like, you know. And,
and that's, I don't want to say that's lost, but that's lost in all of the gear that's certainly all the virtual gear that's out there today. It's
It
like,
is.
you know, I've got a really good friend of mine who's a producer here in town, Clark Rigsby, and his first reaction to plugins were, well, that's not an 1176. That's a picture of an 1176, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I mean, there was some validity to it where it's like, okay, well, you got to prove that to me that that's the same
Yeah,
as
yeah.
the other thing, you know.
You know, listen, there are some great advantages to it. You know, I love the repeatability. The
100%.
recall, you know, absolutely. I love the idea that we don't have to, like, you know, mark the face of it with grease pencils to try and replicate what we had yesterday. All of that stuff.
Well,
you know?
I had a friend of mine here recently complaining about the price of plugins, you know, and I was like,
Really?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it was, in fairness, it was an expensive plugin in the context of what plugins are today.
Okay.
But I said to him, you know, I said, you know, if you had a piece of hardware that would do this, and it was $800, you'd be rushing to your checkbook to
That's
buy
right.
it.
And you'd only be able to use
And
it one instance.
you only have one instance of it.
Exactly.
I said, so, you know, I mean, for me, the entire digital thing was worth having Pultecs in digital form.
Sure.
That was, I mean, they're everywhere in my mixes. And, you know, I just think about where we were before we had that ability,
Yeah.
you know.
A compressor on every channel. Who could do that?
Yeah. Well,
You know?
and why would you? You know, I mean,
Well, yeah,
you know,
exactly.
But it's nice having it there, right?
It's nice having the option.
accessibility.
You know.
So for me, really in the digital mixing world, there were two things that really shaped what I was doing technically, right? The ability to have multiple instances of Pultec available to me anywhere I wanted to use it, and to be able to have tape saturation available to me.
Now that's a big one. Yeah.
That's a huge one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really underestimated in my opinion. I remember coming out of the studio and getting into live work. And, you know, I mean, there's so many moving parts in live. You know,
Yeah.
you can't, but I always remember having, and I couldn't put it together at the time, but I remember having these thoughts of, why does that just not, like you'd push up an input, like, especially like a drum or bass guitar or something like that, and just think, it's not it. You know, I mean, it's just not right. Until probably all the way until we got to digital where I could get tape saturation on it. And I thought, of course, it's the tape we're
It is.
missing out here.
It is. Yeah.
Right?
It's using those tools for, again, you know, it's using it for something that it wasn't necessarily intended
Yeah.
for. We didn't do tape saturation because we wanted it.
Well, you only had input saturation at your disposal.
Yeah.
Like if you wanted to, you know, get some harmonics happening on input, you had to overdrive the input and then offset the gain somewhere
Yeah.
else on the console.
Yeah.
But I mean, in those early days of the 80s and 90s of sound reinforcement, I mean, your toolkit was so rudimentary,
It was.
you know?
And it was the other thing about it that I really love, and you know, if you want to talk about digital, my favorite thing about digital is that I can get the same thing twice.
Yeah.
You know, and that was, you know, I mean, I remember, you know, at the end of every session, we would get an Instamatic camera and we would take a picture of the surface of the console because that was your recall.
I know. I remember doing that many times.
Yeah, you know, and the idea of being able to replicate that again tomorrow, you know, and not have to wait for the synth to warm up,
Yeah.
you know, and the tube mics to warm up and everything, you know, it's like just knowing
And it's a
that I could
humid
get it.
day. It doesn't sound right.
Exactly, exactly. So that part right there, and then of course the other thing is undo.
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, we were talking about razor blades, you know, I mean, there's no undo, you know, and I learned how to splice tape well enough that I could, you know, that I could do it, but I never got over the abject terror just before I made that cut
Yeah.
because you can't go back.
Well, you know, I mean, that's another piece of the mentality, almost the ensemble mentality, right? Of you have to learn to commit,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
As opposed to, well, no, we're going to just record multiple takes. We'll figure it out at mix.
Oh, and then
You
you've
know,
got
and then
120
well, we're
guitar
going to reamp,
solos.
and we're going to, you know,
Yeah.
it's like, okay, I mean, it's awesome that we have this capability. I mean, it really is incredible that we have it, but
But we abuse it.
we so abuse it.
Yeah.
You know, we so abuse it.
We do. And we don't know what it's like to have to commit.
Yeah,
and I think that's...
I'm even going to rephrase what I just said. I don't know that we abuse it, but we allow it to let us have disrespect for making the choice and what that means at the moment, you know?
And that was exactly the question I was going to ask you, is how that has changed. But you just put your finger on exactly it. It has changed the way we create.
Without question, it
Yeah.
has. Yeah,
Yeah.
without question. I mean, you know, and has it made it more creative? in some ways, certainly, certainly.
It's different, that's all.
But I think we're going to agree on this. I've always lived, and I've preached this to some musicians and other people that I work with when we're in the studio, because there's this fluffy concept of it, of, this is art. There should be no boundaries. We should be able to do anything we want to do. And my take on it was boundaries are important.
Yes.
Right? Having
Yes.
boundaries in place and being forced, it's just a horrible word to use, but forced to create within those boundaries drives the most creativity.
Absolutely. It's what I was talking about with,
Right.
having just a Juno 106, I had to make it do everything.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. If you are really forced to have certain parameters, then you're going to make the most out of everything you have.
I mean, look, we live in a boundaryless society technically right now in terms of music culture. I mean, what's a good drum sound? Whatever one we're using.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
that's really where it's at today. So it is completely boundaryless. But how much work is actually getting done? I mean, think about the amount of time that you have to spend to get that done. I'll give you this example because I love this story. So apparently toward the end of Def Leppard's Hysteria record, right? They had been working on this record for 5 years now. Apparently Joe Elliott came in the studio one day very depressed, and we're like, Joe, what's going on? What's happening? He goes, I had the realization this morning that we've been working on this record longer than Cream's entire career.
Oh.
I thought, that's called context, my friend. right there,
Yeah, exactly.
So
And
I
how
was
many
like,
albums did they put out in that time? What, 4 or 5?
Yeah, I mean, it's just crazy.
Double
But,
album,
different
yeah.
times, different
Well,
times.
yeah. But it is really true. It's not just the technology that has changed, it's how it has changed what we do.
Well, yeah, without question.
Yeah.
Without question.
And that, I mean, it's interesting to me to see now how there is sort of a fascination with some younger people to go back to that sort of analog, challenge, so to speak. And
Well,
I like that.
and I've held this view for a long time that many times when people say, I prefer analog, it really has less to do with sound quality than it has to do with the analog approach.
Procedure,
right? The
yes.
procedure.
Yes.
I mean, you're sitting right next to a turntable. I mean, I love being able to pull down a record and put the album on. That's the analog part of it that I love. I don't think it sounds necessarily any better, but I love that piece of it. I love that part of it. And I think it's very much true in the studio. There is a pace to analog recording that does not exist in digital.
That is true. Not just a pace, but a development curve.
That's what I mean.
A track. Yes.
Especially,
yes.
I noticed it especially with recording vocals. Shipley was so great at this. Gosh, you being able to take vocal takes and get around, like the machine was in the room. He knew the spin up of the machine. He knew exactly how far back he was, and could just get into this beautiful rhythm of rewind, vocal take. Really tough to do in a DAW.
It is. It is.
I mean, you can be so quick in DAW where it's just like, just take after take after take, and have a million takes and then have to go through and sort it all out.
Well, that's the problem.
Yeah.
That then you are sorting that out, and then one starts to sound like another, and you start shortcutting it, and all of that. Who was it that was telling me this? Oh, Ed Stasium. Now Eddie's one of his first sessions, he told me, was Midnight Train to Georgia.
Oh, wow.
Right? And he said Gladys Knight recorded the entire vocal take, one take, and then she called him up a couple of weeks later and said, I want to replace one line.
Yeah.
And that, to me, the continuity of that performance, sure, you don't necessarily know it, you don't hear it, but you do hear it.
You feel it.
Yeah.
It's a sense. That
It
you
is.
have, yeah.
It is. And
Whether
I think
you even
that's-
recognize that it's happening,
Yeah, yeah. And then, if you listen to I love all that deconstructed Beatles stuff because you can actually listen and hear the evolution of, okay, we played it through one time and this, and then next time I'm going to try phrasing the vocal a little bit differently and all of this little stuff.
It's funny because I've said to Mary Jo, we were listening to some of that stuff, the demos and the early takes and stuff. I said, really, all this proves to me is that they absolutely took the right takes.
Yeah.
They picked the right ones,
Absolutely. Yeah.
But that's a hard thing to get across to like new musicians or musicians who haven't really had a lot of experience in the studio. That idea of what makes that one better than this one? Why do I need to keep doing this? Isn't that one good enough? You know, that, and the producer's ear is the one that has that to go, no, we're not quite there. You know, let's keep going. And that's a challenge.
Oh,
That is a really, really big, and it's the same thing for mixes, you know, when is a mix finished?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
When does it have the goods?
Yeah. Yeah.
That takes years to develop those kind of ears where you can sense
does.
it and drive toward it. You know, kind of that idea I'm always talking about with people is work with intent, you know.
Yes.
Don't fumble around, you know, put some intent on it and mean what you do, you know.
And knowing when it's done.
Yeah.
That's the thing, you know.
Knowing
really
when to quit. Well, certainly with mixes in the studio, it drives the old adage, right? You know, we don't ever fix mixes. We just stop working or finish mixes.
Yeah.
We just stop working on them, right? So
it's true. So let me conclude with the question I ask almost everybody.
Almost everybody?
Almost
Okay.
everybody. Well, sometimes it's not applicable, but in your case, it certainly is. You came up during a much different era. You have worked with, not only worked with, but impacted all of these changes that we've been talking about. What do you say to a 15-year-old version of you coming up now in this day and age who wants to get into it?
I've been asked this question by a few 15-year-olds.
And you didn't tell them to run?
You know, really, it's about getting a little bit of focus. You know, it's focus kind of balanced with experimentation, right? Because certainly anybody that's getting into live mixing, you know, or getting into live sound, let's say, you know, they will ask me, how do I get in? How do I do what you do? You know, and my response to them always is, okay, you need to figure out which piece of this you want to go after, right? Like you can't just say I want to be in live sound because you're going to end up just at the bottom of the rung doing who knows what, you know?
Right.
Again, kind of work with some intent. If you want to be a mixer, there are certain paths that will get you there as a mixer, okay? If you want to be a systems engineer, well, that's a certain path as well, right? So for a 15-year-old, none of that's going to make sense.
Right.
Right. But for the 15-year-old, I would say to them, experience as much as you can about this. Get in, it doesn't, at the dirt level, it doesn't matter. You just got to get in and make this as experiential as you can in these years, right? And as you start to get some focus on what piece of it you might want to do, then dive in head first on that. Like even with schools, you know, I'm the last person to tell somebody you should go to a school first thing. It's like, get out and work in it. You know, get out and work in it, because audio in particular is such a dark art. You know, I mean, we can't touch it, we can't see it, you know, and, you know, all of this language and this lexicon of terms and everything that we have in audio, I mean, it's just foreign, you know.
And it doesn't mean anything without context.
Yeah.
You know, what's that
So
old phrase
get
about
out-
dancing about architecture, you know, trying to talk about it? Yeah.
Get out and do it for a little while and be immersed in it for a little while, and then come back to school and you will retain so much more of it, you know. But
Well-
I mean, I can't imagine today, you know, getting into audio compared to where I got in because of the immensity of product
The complexity.
and the complexity of it. You know,
Sure,
I mean,
yeah.
you just have to. I guess what I would say to anybody that's getting into it, man, spend some time in fundamental audio. I mean, you have to understand the fundamentals. When I started out, we only had the fundamentals.
Right. Right.
And I mean, you had to have it down cold, right? And that, you know, your results were really, you know, served by that. But today it's so easy to jump way ahead and, you know, get so out of balance with it, you know, and not really understand the fundamentals. So really, I guess kind of dig in on fundamentals. I would also tell them, please stay away from Reddit. Okay. Okay. I had a great discussion here not long ago on my online meeting, you know, the back lounge. I was talking to Sean Sullivan, and he had gone on to Reddit, and some issue had come up, and he was giving them the answer on how to solve it, and he just got shredded on there. I mean, and I've gone on there a couple times, and I just go, this is just absolute poison. I don't know who would go on here. I mean, you have hundreds of people, thousands maybe, talking with absolute authority on things, and you just go, that's just 100% wrong what you're saying there.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and it's like, and who are you? And where did you get this? I mean, it's just,
Oh,
it's
and not
so
just Reddit.
destructive.
Yes.
It's so destructive.
Yeah, I mean, Reddit's the most egregious version of that, but you know, you've got the gear page, as they're called now, and you know, all of these. Yes, there's so much misinformation.
I just avoid them like the plague now. You know, it's like, I'm not going to fix that world. And, you know, I just get shredded when I'm on there anyway. It's like, okay, yeah, whatever, old man. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but well, you know, and another thing about that too, though, going back to what you were saying, is that in learning those fundamentals, I think a lot of times we discover things we didn't know that we might be interested in.
Yeah. Oh, well, for sure.
You know, because you think you want to do this, but you end up somewhere else.
Well, I kind of had a little bit of that journey where I came up, you know, really on the science end of it. I kind of had that cold at a pretty young age and pushed really hard toward the creative aspect of it, only to figure out that, you know, if I want to make the creativity part of it sound really good, I got to go back and know these fundamentals. You know, it's like I got to glue all that back together. It's that whole concept of being able to take the left brain and use it creatively.
And figure out what you missed. You know, because a lot of that, as you say, a lot of that comes from being self-taught. When you're learning stuff, you don't necessarily get all those details, and then you start figuring out what you better go back and learn in order to be better at what you've already learned.
Yeah.
So that's
It's an amazing journey, really.
It really is. Yeah. Well, you seem to have done okay. You know.
Still hanging in there.
Yeah. Well, still having fun, obviously.
I'm having more fun mixing now than I've had in years and years and years. I mean, I feel like I have a good handle on it. The music's great. It's fun to mix.
Well, yeah,
I love it.
you ended up at a great camp too. Those are just wonderful people.
Oh,
you know,
the musicianship there is just off the chain. You know, I mean, it's just so great. So.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, you've done well, and hopefully you will continue to.
Yeah, a few more years. You know,
yeah.
I got a few more years in me.
Oh, I think so. Excellent, Robert Scovill. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you, sir. Thank you
been
for
a pleasure.
stopping by. Nice to have you at the house. That's great.
Absolutely. Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.